Music has always been a crucial part of my life, an integral part of my soul. But these days, like most people, my relationship with music is fractured, damaged. I'm finally taking it back. During the revolution of Napster, LimeWire, eMule, and FrostWire, I lived in Winamp. That classic UI is burned into my mind. But I remember so fondly getting my very first iPod and switching to iTunes right away. Since I had a tiny, cheap MP3 player first, I was late to the game. My first iPod was the beautiful, glassy, black iPod Video, the 5th generation. I had a 60GB model and loaded that thing up with my favorite music from my mom's iTunes account, since I didn't have a credit card yet, CD rips, and random videos from LimeWire. I used that thing every single day. At home, waiting for school to start, in between classes at school, hoping I would get caught, and I did eventually get caught and got detention over it once in my sophomore year of high school. After school, waiting on the public bus, I wore my way through so many pairs of earbuds. It was crazy. Then, my junior year of high school, I discovered the incredible world of lossless music through the FLAC format, and everything changed. I hacked my iPod to run Rockbox with a sick theme, played my lossless music through it, and felt like I was in the recording studio myself. Only to then trade that iPod to my parents towards the end of my senior year so they would buy me an iPod Touch 4, because I just had to have the HD video camera and the apps it could run. I regret making that decision. The camera wasn't that great. My mini DV camcorder at the time was about on par with it, and it held a lot less music. I still have the iPod Touch. I'm not sure what to do with it, but my iPod Video is sadly long gone. What I do have here is my parents' second iPod, the 7th gen iPod Classic. This thing was made of all metal, and it was a beast at the time, with an upgraded 160GB hard drive. I can't use it though. Thing is, they left it plugged in their car for years, so on top of it being antiquated and a little gross, the battery is as dead as it gets. Plus, I want to listen to my lossless CD rips I've been spending time on recently. So it's time to revive this old iPod and bring it into the modern era, better than it ever was before. It's time to restart my music collection. I bought all the parts for this project back in December of 2023, and like with most electronics projects that I don't have an immediate top priority for video content, like my Cyberdeck project that's been waiting on me since 2022, the parts sat in a box for 9 months waiting on me to start. Well, I fly out to TwitchCon next week and I want to be able to listen to music as I travel. I canceled my YouTube Premium subscription and I don't want to use my phone for music, so it's time to get the iPod ready. The process was pretty self-explanatory. First, you have to take the iPod apart, then swap the relevant parts, then put it back together. I watched a single video before starting, DinkPod's video about why the 7th gen iPods, the one I have, are the worst to open because of the metal shell.
This is a friggin' fortress.
I sighed deeply and went at it. I didn't worry too much about scuffing up my outer shell as I'd be replacing it, but be prepared for some scratching if it's your first time for sure. This took a lot of finagling, and you'll definitely want an electronics kit of some sort like my iFixit kit here, not a sponsor, to use the spudgers to leverage the case open, but eventually I got it. It was perfectly smooth until the last little tab on the bottom where I really bent the metal back, just out of shape. I could have fixed it if I was reusing it, but thankfully I'm ditching the original parts here. The spudger that came with my iPod parts was small enough to fit in the iPod. I'm grateful that I had it. But oh boy, it got absolutely destroyed by this process. One-time use. I grabbed all my parts for this build from Elite Obsolete Electronics. They're kind of the main supplier for iPod mods these days. Again, not a sponsor. That plus a general high-level GitHub guide on iPod modding will be linked in the description below to help you get started. I went with a lovely purple front shell and a center button and a beautiful rainbow iridescent back shell. This one is iPod labeled but doesn't have size on it since we'll be customizing our size. Also, look how tiny the original hard drive was. I've never seen such a tiny hard drive. Especially for when the iPod came out, this is incredible. Plus that little baby battery, oh man, that's hardly any battery at all. We're upgrading that with this beefy 3800 milliamp hour battery that should let the iPod run for days without charging. This is such an insane upgrade, but the bigger battery requires more space in the chassis, plus I needed more modern storage anyway. So we, of course, went with the iFlash Quad, a replacement board that emulates the internal hard drive of the iPod and lets me slot in 4 micro SD cards. You could go with a mini SSD or something here, but everything I read said the SSD was worse on battery life, so I went with 3 256GB micro SD cards and 1 512GB, giving me plenty of space for all the music I could possibly want, especially since I am keeping it relatively minimal here.
You got enough room to steal everybody's music.
But before you put your micro SD cards in, plug them into a computer and reformat them as exFAT. Even if they came as exFAT out of the box, the way the partitions are set up in the factory can cause issues with the iFlash recognizing them or freezing or other issues. So just do yourself a favor and reformat them ahead of time before installing. Getting everything arranged and plugged back in was a little tedious, but once it's all done, it shut up quite nicely. Perfect fit. I had to unscrew and reattach the structural frame on this since I was switching front plates. You don't have to do this step if you're just upgrading storage. My only complaint is that through all this, I got a little dust under the lens for the screen. It really irks me, but you don't really see it too much once it's turned on, and I don't have the heart to risk damaging my shell to crack it open again. Oh well. Before I can test or use this, I need to have music to put in it. The truth? I'm nuking my old folders and starting over. Too much downloaded junk, mixed formats, duplicates, and so on. I want a fresh music folder. Sadly, my original Winamp and iTunes playlists are long gone, abandoned after I switched from my iPod Touch to streaming on a smartphone, and most of the iTunes music formats sound like crap anyway. Plus, pretty much all of my music purchases were licensed under my mom's iTunes account, not my own. I want to have it local, played in a good standard media player. I tried FooBar, I tried streaming through PlexAmp and Jellyfin. I don't like it. Next was to start ripping music. I still buy CDs sometimes, though I've been primarily collecting vinyl and cassettes since about 2016 or so, and I've started buying them again for albums I want to listen to. I don't just buy them to rip, however. I pop them into a 5 CD changer I grabbed from Goodwill and jam out while I do dishes, paint with my kiddo, and so on. The cost of a streaming music service basically covers 1 new CD a month or more, but you get to be a lot more deliberate and intentional with what you choose. This builds a more meaningful connection with the media and helps me appreciate what I'm listening to a lot more. And it gives the music a lot more value than just skimming through the 2-minute lo-fi stream beats, study beats playlist of the week. The physicality of the case, the album artwork, perusing the lyrics, or discovering that someone unexpected worked on an album behind the scenes is neat enough. But often physical copies are coming in unique cases or with extra goodies. Overseas, K-pop albums are really going wild with collector's edition releases, with magnets, photo books, stickers, posters, and some, like these aespa albums, come formatted as little zines, which I absolutely love. I'm not exactly the target market for all this idol culture stuff, but I adore this much involvement in the physical medium and getting the listener engaged on a deeper level. I wish Western music would do this more with CD releases, but I guess we see that in other forms, with the vinyl collector's editions and the rise in floppy disk and cassette tape releases and even CDI releases? My rule for my new digital collection is to only have music I ripped or paid for myself, with a tiny handful of exceptions for certain shared albums among friends, targeting FLAC for just about everything, though there's a couple albums in there that were only distributed in lossy formats, unfortunately, and otherwise only the stuff I want in the folder. No more hoarding entire discographies just because I can. This is a much slower approach, but one that means I don't end up with inflated playlists of hundreds of songs that I'm just constantly skipping through to find the bangers. It also means I need to buy more albums, and it means that while I loved my old CD mixes I have from middle and high school, I'm not ripping those for this library either. If you don't know what the heck a FLAC is a lossless audio codec that just packs up the uncompressed audio from WAV files or a CD into a compressed zip-like file. There's literally no downside to using it compared to keeping uncompressed audio. Meanwhile, it saves on space and supports metadata tagging for artist names, song titles, album art, and so on, which WAV files do not. If you haven't really sat down and listened to lossless music before, be it a FLAC rip on Tidal or a CD or vinyl with a nice set of speakers or a good pair of headphones, I strongly encourage you to do so at some point. I remember the exact moment I heard the difference between crappy compressed LimeWire copy of a 3 Days Grace song I had versus my lossless CD rip I had just done, and I had to pull my dad in to listen with me, as it was just such a night and day difference. Obviously, we listened to tons of CDs, but like hearing it through the computer, you understood at the time why it mattered. Anyway, I'm using FreeAC to rip the CDs to FLAC. It's a free audio ripper similar to EAC that I showed before, but it works on Windows, Mac, and Linux and makes it super easy to set and forget for CD ripping. It pulls the online CD database for metadata, and I've only had one CD of my bunch so far that I've had to manually input song information in for, and I submitted that upstream, so hopefully it saves other people the hassle. In the options, just change the encoder to FLAC, change the compression level to 8, and then choose how you want your files to be named and where you want them to go. By default, it makes a new folder for every album, and so I just pointed at my music folder on my desktop PC and let it rip, although I think I'm changing it to make a new folder for artist and then album. I only really have to intervene to combine multi-disc rips and to download cover art. Unfortunately, it does not seem to graph cover art automatically, but you can often bulk download cover art with your preferred media player app. I use Strawberry, and I can use its cover manager to fetch missing cover art and export those to the album folders, which is wonderful. Just remember to donate to free software if you get a bunch of use out of it. People can't spend hours and hours developing this stuff without any contributions. The final stage of this music collection will just involve combing through my YouTube Music likes and reacquiring CDs or singles whenever I can. This will take a while, but the collection is slowly building. Time to see if I killed my iPod or not. I plugged my shiny new iPod in with a fancy light-up 30-pin USB cable and ran into some additional issues. You see, to initially get this working, even if you're planning on jailbreaking it, you need to restore it in iTunes. Let me say that again. You need to restore the iPod in iTunes. Well, I was just going to use my Mac that I use for work for editing videos and stuff here, since it is an Apple iPod. But good old Apple would rather erase 20 years of history and pretend iTunes doesn't exist anymore. The Music app does not have the functionality to restore the iPod, but Finder does. However, it just won't do it. No matter how many times I reboot, replug, whatever, just clicking restore does nothing. So I had to switch to a Windows PC, download iTunes there, sign in, and hit restore. And it worked the first time. Phew! Now I was off to the races. It even recognizes the full 1.2 terabytes of storage we loaded this iPod up with, both in Explorer and in the iPod OS somehow. I always read that if you go over the original storage capacity, the official firmware only sees enough space for that original amount, or the maximum amount that the generation of iPod officially supported. But my iPod OS reads the full amount. It's pretty crazy. If I could send a screenshot of this to myself back in high school, I would have probably just died right on the spot, brain melting out of my ears or something. I didn't even have a terabyte hard drive at all just yet. Just to test things out, I linked my iTunes account to see what music I owned. I don't own much on my personal account, as I mentioned, but there's a few. Sure enough, transferring songs to my iPod works. Other than... what? Apparently, I own an album on Apple Music versus, an older iTunes purchase, but I'm not allowed to transfer that to my iPod despite having purchased it. This kind of licensing bullshit is what kills music's value and is anti-consumer to someone who both bought Apple's hardware and music through their service. And before the manifestos get posted in the comments about how Apple is so bad and I never should have supported them in the first place, everyone is doing this. Digital media is fleeting. There is no ownership. It's anti-consumer. Hell, when ripping my CDs, I tried to redeem the bonus tracks that were supposed to come with my Halo 4 soundtrack because they decided to limit 6 tracks to some sort of digital exchange for some bizarre reason. And the main page works, but the redeem button sends me through a massive adware funnel to some Australian cologne site. Oh dear. Since all that seemed to work, it was time to fire up the Rockbox installer. It's crazy how the same tool I used way back in high school to jailbreak my original iPod is still the tool we use now. The process was fairly straightforward. Select your iPod, choose 6th Gen Classic even if you're using a 7th Gen iPod for some reason, choose your theme. I much like the Adawada Pod Lite and Interpod 2 for the more iOS style feel, or Digital Redux or Carbon Plus for a more hacker theme. And then click install. At some point in the process, you have to hold select and menu to reboot into the bootloader, but the installer takes care of the rest. Then you're free to make a music folder on the drive and drag in your music. You can put music folders anywhere except the .rockbox hidden folder. So I just put it in the root of the iPod. Easy peasy. Once the music copy's over, which does take a bit, this is a USB 2.0 device, of course, eject and unplug your iPod. Scroll to the settings, pick your theme, change the clock, whatever, then go to database and click initialize. It'll detect your metadata from your music and you'll be ready to rock. Anytime your iPod turns off and you need to switch back to this, you hold menu and select to reboot to the bootloader and go to Rockbox. Otherwise, you'll just be booting in the normal iPod OS. I decided to pair my first iPod listening experience with the first time listening to a special pair of headphones I've also had in the to-do pile since 2021, the Odyssey LCD2 Classic. These beautiful planar magnetic headphones are God's dang near perfect. These are going to be the best pair of headphones I ever experienced in my home, probably ever. I got to try them at a convention a few years past, and they're finally mine. All mine. Only problem is they ship with just a 1/4 inch connector on the beautifully twisted balanced audio connectors, so it looks like I'm doing some sort of wireless hacking with this iPod for now. But don't worry, I have a 3.5mm cable on the way. It was just expensive. High-end audio is wild. Honestly, initial impressions were quite poor. I mostly tried this as a joke experiment to see how good the DAC and amp might be on the iPod, but it was worse than I expected. Then when I switched to another song, it immediately sounded way better. I was hooked, and the next thing I knew, I had just blasted through an entire EP without realizing it. So why did that first song sound so poor? Remember when I loaded up some of my iTunes tracks as a test? Well, I loaded some of the same ones up separately on Rockbox that I had ripped from a CD and accidentally loaded the compressed iTunes copy when I was playing by mistake. Holy cow, was there a huge difference, even with this insane setup. I can tell the iPod isn't achieving the maximum potential of these expensive headphones. That's what this baby will be for soon. But it sounded pretty good. I'll be using this with some Moondrop IEMs when I travel, but this was a fun setup at home. Just gotta be careful. This chonker definitely takes some courage. The IEMs sound wonderful on here though. I'm not a huge fan of earbuds, having molded my ears to them all throughout middle and high school, but as a quick portable setup, I think this will do nicely. Another scenario I want to be able to use my iPod in is my car. I usually streamed YouTube music through Bluetooth to my car, but since I canceled YouTube Premium, I want to use my iPod. My older car supposedly has iPod support, but even with the car mode enabled in Rockbox's settings, the car doesn't seem to cooperate with Rockbox. My options seem to either be to juggle two libraries on my iPod, one through iTunes and one through the normal files, or to use an aux cable. I certainly have the storage capacity for the dual library approach. That's just too much time and hassle, and it's more work to try to avoid the lossy iTunes copies when listening through Rockbox. So I'm choosing to remove all the iTunes music from my iPod and just keep an aux cable paired with my 30-pin USB cable in my car. Easy enough solution. The final step is, of course, to have a comfortable listening spot. Thankfully, that was already taken care of. When we first moved into this house at the start of the pandemic, we had no use for this little nook intended as a dining room since our table doesn't fit, so my wife suggested I make it a music nook. I've got a lovely rocker chair, storage for some vinyl and CDs, and some PreSonus Eris speakers that sound incredible. This windowsill cat bed means the place is always covered in cat fur. But whether I'm rocking out to one of my countless video game soundtracks on vinyl, popping in one of my CDs while I check out the goodies, or read a retro gaming mag, or jam out to my iPod while I doze off, this is the life. There's something neat and exciting about the idea of having access to every song ever streaming live to your phone whenever you want. But that very idea has turned music into content, where musicians are pushed to churn out samey 2-minute garbage to fill playlists and get plays, only to be paid next to nothing for it, and audio quality takes a nosedive. I'd rather be more intentional with the music I listen to, support the artists with multiple hundreds of % more through direct purchases or CDs or albums on Bandcamp, or you can also pick up my experimental ambient album, Desolate, by the way, linked below, and really engage with the media I consume more. I want to go back to building playlists that mean something to me, rather than just having a trendy vibe. And I want to really come to appreciate an artist's body of work rather than just stream songs endlessly with some bundled subscription that saps away my funds while hardly contributing any funds to the artists. It's a lot less convenient of a way of engaging with a medium, but a far more impactful and valuable one. I think it's what a lot of us need these days in a world full of noise. I'm not sure I can convey how quickly I get immersed in my music and focused on whatever else I'm doing when I play music on my iPod with headphones versus scrolling through it on my phone. This iPod is going with me everywhere I go. And it helps that it knows how to shuffle, too. I'll link a few of my favorite artists lately in the description below, along with backing track, which you can use in your videos. We've still got a few cassette tape USB drives you can pick up in my shop of some of the albums, the synthwave albums, as well as a link to my music, as I mentioned. I'm Addy. Join us on the forums, and remember to be kind, rewind.